So I'm here to tell you a little bit about Canada's anti-spam legislation that came into force within the last year or so. And it was coined Canada's anti-spam legislation by a working group that we were a member of some time ago, because the legislation itself actually doesn't have a short name. Most pieces of legislation get some kind of acronym. This one did not, unfortunately, and I think the name does a little bit of a disservice to what this piece of legislation actually covers, because as the title of the presentation, it covers far more than spam, and we'll talk about that. So just a very 2-second disclaimer. I'm here presenting, and my comments today are those of Commission staff and not of the Commission itself. And as well, I'm not representing the Competition Bureau or the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, who have a mandate under this piece of legislation as well, nor those of Industry Canada, who played a role in the design of this piece of legislation and assistance in its implementation. So we'll talk about the new compliance and enforcement sector that was created at the CRTC as a result of this particular piece of legislation and its enforcement mandate. I'll give you an overview of CASL itself. We'll talk about the enforcement challenges now that we've had about 10 months of enforcement activity and some of the successes and challenges that we've seen. And probably the most important comment and messaging I want to convey today is the need to partnership and collaborate. Very, very, very important. And then I'll give a brief overview of the Spam Reporting Center. So here's the new structure. In May 2011, the CRTC determined that it was reasonable to create an entire new sector that is now compliance and enforcement. We also have the mandate for the unsolicited telecommunication rules, that's telemarketing, if you will. And we've since created a new solutions and intelligence division to help support the enforcement activities of both the telecommunications enforcement and the electronic commerce enforcement division, for which I'm responsible. So let's talk a little bit about CASL. CASL came to be, there was a task force created back in 2004 that eventually put out, thanks to Industry Canada, a report that tabled 25 different recommendations. And at that table, and I was fortunate enough at the time, working at the Competition Bureau, to sit at that table, industry was at the table, law enforcement, government, there was a whole host of players, and it was determined that this piece of legislation or this activity, enforcement activity, would best be housed in a civil regime so that it could be a little bit more nimble than a criminal regime. And that the administrative monetary penalties be high enough that they are more than the cost of doing business. And we'll look at those in a minute. And you may have seen some recent headlines with regards to that, and we'll speak to those as well. The other thing that we'll talk about is the information sharing and the collaboration clauses that this piece of legislation sought to include. Very, very important. We recognize the cross-border nature of these particular issues and the need to work collaboratively and share information. And I think this area is going to be something that's going to be of great interest not only to our foreign counterparts but industry alike, because there are some clauses there to allow us to work with industry as well. And as I'm sure many of you understand, there's the notion of vicarious liability and extended liability, if you will. Gone are the days, at least under CASL, where you can hide behind a numbered company that gets charged, if you will, or a violation determined, and then set up shop again the next day under a numbered company. So we can pierce that corporate veil. Very important. And the CRTC also houses the Spam Reporting Center. It was hoped to be housed in the private sector. Unfortunately, We had no viable bids, and we had some systems in place that we were able to leverage at the CRTC, and so it was a great plan B, and it is working out very well, and we'll speak to that a little more. Okay, so here is why I say this is more than just spam. The Competition Bureau has an expanded mandate. They handle the areas that they have both civil and criminal powers. They always dealt with the false and misleading representations in the content, and now their mandate is expanded to include spoofed headers, so false and misleading header information and so forth. So that brings them into the fold of CASL, if you will. And they actually, if you saw the recent headlines, they brought a case against Avis under CASL and levied a $30 million penalty, so pretty substantial. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner, of course, is going to deal with everything that touches on personal information, so spyware, email address harvesting and the like, dictionary attacks. So we are working collaboratively with both of these two agencies and as you can see, the CRTC has the lion's share of the enforcement mandate under CASL. So Section 6 has everything to do with the sending of commercial electronic messaging, and it's couched in sort of technology-neutral language. So that today means anything from, of course, your traditional email, SMS, private messaging platforms on social media, anything of that nature, and of course it has to have a commercial aspect to it. Now, as we know from most nuisance spam that carries a malware payload, it generally has a commercial portion to it, so we touch on quite a bit of the activity out there. Doesn't mean that we touch on all nuisance spam, but as long as there's a commercial activity involved and there doesn't have to be any expectation of profit rather, CASL will apply. As of January 15th of this year, Section 8, which had originally been delayed from the original coming into force date of July 1, 2014, Section 8 came into play. And that looks at malware, the dissemination of malware. So that in technology neutral language, that's the downloading of computer programs without authorization. And it, of course, touches on botnets. As we know, malware often creates bot activity. Section 7 came into play, and we've actually taken one small case, if you will, initially, and we'll touch on that, and that is network rerouting. Think man-in-the-middle type attacks. And interestingly, Section 9 allows us to hold those who aid, induce, or procure any of those services to facilitate any, the dissemination of spam or malware, et cetera. We can hold them accountable as well. So, we have an aiding and abetting clause, if you will. So how do we look at, we have a finite, like every other agency, law enforcement agency, we certainly have finite resources at our disposal. We only have a certain amount of staff to do the work, and there's probably far more than we can do, and hence why I say partnering is going to be so important. But we are going to look at the scope, the egregiousness of the activity, the impact, the harm that it has in the marketplace to Canadians, and not only to Canadians, but to victims that are being victimized by a Canadian outside of the Canadian borders. So we'll definitely be looking to work with our neighboring countries and cooperating countries in this respect. We will also look at trending in the market. So we want to hear from industry players, what's hitting your networks, what threats are you seeing now. That type of information helps us identify cases that we can undertake and create the most impact in the marketplace. Will our case promote compliance? Will it have precedential value? We know that given the process, the notice of violation is issued along with an administrative monetary panel. It's heard by a panel of commissioners who makes the decision on whether to uphold the notice of violation and either maintain or vary the administrative monetary penalty, but there's an opportunity for that person or persons to appeal it. And so we know that these appeals are going to set some precedential value and help us sort of determine some of our thresholds for activity. So there are a whole host of things that we look at when we're prioritizing our cases. Now, the new violations came with some enforcement investigative powers, and those include, under CASL, we have the ability to require them to preserve transmission data. We know that this data is ephemeral. It's often not maintained for very long. So if we can get a heads up right away that there's some activity, hitting one of the networks, we can get in there. It's as quick as one of the managers on the team signing off with a preservation demand, and that data is preserved for 21 days. We have a possibility of extending for another 21 days until we can get our notice to produce together, requiring them to produce the data. Now, the notice to produce is also very, very quick. It can be put together, inside of a day and sent out. And we try and work cooperatively. We found that to be the most expeditious in getting the information when it's from third-party cooperating groups. So we'll call them up and say, help us define the language so that you can meet this this notice to produce. And we've used this tool. We've not had call to use the preservation demand yet, only because Section 8 only just came into play. But the notice to produce has been used multiple times, and it's been extremely, extremely helpful in moving our cases forward. We also have cease and desist. So if there are some uncooperating third parties, bulletproof hosters, that type of thing, we have the restraining orders that we can leverage as well as injunctions. We also have the ability to go to a justice of the peace and get a search warrant. So if we feel that there is a bulletproof hoster or some other party that might not be cooperative with a notice to produce, we do have some forensically trained officers on board. We're training more all the time. As Carrie said, that is part of my background. So I know the importance of it, not only just for seizing information data, but just holistically for doing the investigations, especially when it speaks to malware and botnets and the like. The outcome, of course, on the far end of the investigation, we can either negotiate a settlement, which means a notice of violation would stand along with the administrative monetary penalty, or under CASL, they have an alternative tool that is very similar to a notice to violation. It's called an undertaking, and it's actually registered in a court, unlike the negotiated settlement. And it does not include an AMP per se, an administrative monetary penalty, but it does include monies to be paid. So the notice of violation is not actually issued, but basically it's a voluntary position the company is taking to cooperate and come into compliance with the legislation. And we've actually used that as well, that tool, and it's been very successful so far. Now, the interesting thing about these particular enforcement powers, and we'll touch on it a little bit more in depth, but we can make these available to our law enforcement colleagues. So there are some criteria, and we'll talk about that, but basically we're not required to have an investigation underway ourselves. If you see there's a Canadian nexus, one that we can assist you with, as long as the activity is similar to that's under CASL, we can issue a preservation demand. We can issue a notice to produce and assist. We've had great success so far working with the U.S. And the Federal Trade Commission, and they've done that for us in issuing their CIDs and so forth. So it's already starting to work. We're very pleased with that. So as I said, more than the cost of doing business. So up to $1 million per violation for an individual, and up to $10 million per violation for an organization. And a violation, as we've determined, is there are 3 possible violations under Section 6. There's 3 different elements, being consent, identification, and an unsubscribe, a working unsubscribe. And then, of course, you've got your violation for Section 7, 8, and or 9. So there's a possibility for multiple violations within one investigation. So these numbers can add up quite quickly. Now, the legislation does set out all the different elements that we have to consider when we're assessing the amount of the administrative monetary penalty. Remains to be seen. Our first one was over $1 million. So. And as I said, the extended liability, there's vicarious liability as well as director-officer liability, so there's no more hiding behind that corporate veil. We can bring the directors into accountability. So let's talk a little bit about one of our first cases that looked like millions. Well, hundreds of thousands is what we first saw, some of the spam that was being disseminated. This was pre-Section 8. This was an early case in July-ish, I guess. I'm trying to remember. I think we saw the activity actually prior to the coming into force, and then we brought it into an active case after July 1 when the legislation actually came into play. And we thought that it was actually a service provider, Access Communications. No problem naming them. We've named them in the press. And it turned out to be an infected client on their server. When we started looking deeper, that's when we realized that they weren't actually, sending out all the spam, that they were actually infected with malware. So if you look at the red line is the autonomous system that shows the amount of activity, and the blue line was the activity we were seeing specific to that particular server. So by correlation, in the 2-month period, there was about 94 million spam messages being sent out through that autonomous system, where our particular target was the majority of that activity. So from that, we know that we stopped millions and millions of spam continuing to be sent out because this particular company, small company, was unaware that they were infected. Now, when we reached out to them, our goal, or our mandate, if you will, is not remediation. That really is a public safety CSIRC type mandate. But we were happy in this instance. It was also a learning curve for us. We worked with them so that they could clean up their own servers. And as you can see, I think it was at the end of July, it dropped to 0. So we knew that our activity in working with both Access and the client, Access's client, that we mitigated the sending of, 94 million, at least 94 million in the immediate future after that. So a couple of more recent headlines that came out recently. We recently levied a notice of violation with a $1.1 million administrative monetary penalty against a company known as CompuFinder, and they're in Quebec. And they've been, if you Google them, you'll see they've been the source of consternation for folks for several years. They tend to target, they offer training services, if you will, to businesses in a variety of spheres, but like admin assistant, different types of Excel training, just a variety of different sort of business training. Typically, we would not go public on just the issuance of a notice of violation. But this particular company had been somewhat uncooperative during the process and had actually leaked information, and so we wanted to ensure that we were out of the gate before them with that information. So this case is ongoing at the moment, but this was the headline, and if you Google this, you'll find the press release and all the rest of it. But it has not concluded yet, so we don't know where this is going to land. We did use the undertaking, as I described earlier, in a case against Plenty of Fish. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Plenty of Fish, which is a dating social media type site, which purports to have, was the last number, 300,000 active users at any one given time or something. So they've grown quite large, even though they're a free, predominantly a free dating site. And the issue here was about their unsubscribe. And that's why and I'll tell you a little bit why the amount is so low. They came into compliance immediately. It was more about not the fact that they didn't have an unsubscribe mechanism, but that the unsubscribe mechanism was so onerous that the end user was having a difficult time unsubscribing. But they immediately changed their practices right through, discussions, and so we offered them an undertaking, and this was the amount that we settled on. So they've come into compliance. So we have a sharing agreement between the three agencies. We've defined that, so we know we can work together and share information. Very important because, as I said, one of the agencies has criminal powers. And so we need to make sure that we deconflict between the agencies. Section 60 is what I was talking about earlier about sharing information. This states clearly that we can share information with our foreign counterparts. There has to be some reciprocity. The activity has to be similar to that is identified under CASL. And as I said, we don't need to have an investigation underway. And I'll just, because we're short on time, there's some, we can get into, and this presentation will be available. I'm making it available, so you can speak to the organizers to get a copy. The arrangements are very, very nimble. They are on a case-by-case basis, no requirements to have an overarching MOU or some onerous agreement. So as long as we meet the test under Section 60, we're good to go on a very quick basis. So we want to hear from you. If there's a Canadian nexus, if your country citizens are being violated, if you will, if they're being harassed by spam or malware emanating out of Canada, the CRTC is certainly one of the calls that you should be making. So quickly, the Spam Reporting Center, it takes in all of the complaints. Spam, you can either fill out an actual complaint or you can forward your spam or your SMS, and the public-facing website is hosted by Industry Canada at fightspam.gc.ca. In terms of malware, we're working with Public Safety, who have a fantastic malware database and in-house skill sets, so we're working closely with them as well. And to date, we have over 280,000 submissions. And just to put that in perspective, the unsolicited telecommunication rules has the do not call registry. Dana, help me with the number. They have 900,000 since 2008. We have 280 in the space of about 9 months. And we're getting about 1,000 a week, I think, is our number. 1,000 a day. 1,000 a day, yeah. So we're taking in honeypot feeds. So it's not the only data we're taking in. We're always looking to augment the data. And just to wrap up, the Spam Reporting Center provides support to the three agencies with access to the data, and more specifically to the electronic evidence team and the TE team, the telecom team with intelligence. So they do some triaging, they ferret out other intelligence, they reach out to some of our partners as well to support the enforcement activities. And of course, success, well, if we can bring somebody into compliance, if we can lessen the burden, help clean up infected PCs so that botnets are remediated, all of these different things we view as success. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I've been given the hook, and it might sound like I've drunk the Kool-Aid at, all things CASL, but we're working out the kinks. I mean, it's one thing to have it on paper in terms of having a piece of legislation implemented. It's another thing to actually apply it and see how it works in the real world. And we're making some strides. So we're pleased. You'll see more announceables in the coming weeks in terms of new cases that have been under investigation for some time. So thank you.